So now we move into the next section, because I really think the next section begins when it says, said hopeful, all right? Third paragraph. That's really sort of now moving into the next part. And you'll see why as I read ahead here. Said hopeful, I acknowledge myself in a fault, and had I been here alone, I had, by sleeping, run the danger of death. I see it as true that the wise man saith, two are better than one. Quote, almost a direct quote from Ecclesiastes 4:9. Hitherto hath thy company been my mercy, and thou shalt have a good reward for thy labor. Okay, so the turn is in the fact that hopeful says, I'm glad I have you with me to protect me in this. Okay. Now, I suppose we could just pause there and point out what we've already seen a number of times in the past, and that is that the basic philosophy of iron sharpens iron is being represented here. We walk together as believers. Christianity has never been designed as a Lone Ranger thing. I know a lot of Christians sort of treat it that way, as though I do my thing, you do yours, and never the two shall meet. But that's not really what is designed. We are designed to come together. The Spirit of God draws a people together in Christ, and that drawing us together is designed for our good. Because sometimes you need somebody to kick you in the pants and to say, oh, my friend, don't fall asleep. Wake up, pay attention, listen, learn, etc. We need that. Sometimes we need that. I know it's not comfortable. Nobody likes discipline when it comes, right? Nobody likes to be told, even by someone else, that they need to be thinking differently or better than they are. No one likes that. But that's what the church is about. That's what we are as a group of people. Those who think that you can just get along as Christians without the church have made a fatal mistake, because they are subject to the forces of this world without the help of others, which is what the Spirit of God has purposed for us. So hopeful acknowledges, yes, I'm wrong. Drowsiness is wrong. I shouldn't have done that. We were told by the shepherds, don't fall asleep in that place. You remember the shepherds back in the Delectable Mountains told them, don't watch out for sleeping on enchanted ground. Okay, you're right. You're right. Now then, said Christian, to prevent drowsiness in this place, let us fall into good discourse. Okay, so let's have a conversation. Let's talk. Okay? Where shall we begin, says hopeful. Christian replies, where God began with us. But do you begin, if you please? That probably said like, okay, you start. You go ahead. You speak first. Do you mean how came I at first to look after the good of my soul? You're asking me how I came to the place of seeing for my soul? What is he asking for? What is Christian asking for? What's the simpler word we use for that? What is your testimony? Personally, I like the word conversion better, but what is your testimony? Tell me how you came to faith, or tell me how you came to the betterment of your soul. Isn't that really what conversion is? And Christian says, yes, that is my meaning. So now what you're going to see as we move into Memories of Faithful, hopeful is going to explain how it is that he came to faith and wound up on this journey next to Christian. Now, I am convinced that Bunyan puts this here because he wants to be very clear with the readership of this allegory of what he perceives the gospel to actually be. So he's going to paint hopeful's testimony in such a way as to be able to articulate through the lips of hopeful what the actual gospel is. Because you and I have had this conversation many times. I know I've said it from the pulpit many times. You've probably heard it many times. The problem is that if you're not careful with the gospel, it can be changed. Paul warns against all kinds of false teachers in his writings, doesn't he? Because what do? that come in and they change the gospel. They articulate it to be something other than what it really is. What is the fundamental nature of the gospel? Now, let me just compare and contrast here for a moment. In the 16th and in the 17th century, in the days of, I know I said 16 before, sorry, it's the 17th century, 1600s. In the 17th century, the gospel that was understood by the Western church had been deeply warped by Rome over the period of about 1,000 years. It's the very reason that the Reformation broke out. Now, I realize we're 100 years into the Reformation at this point, but still, the vast majority of people in England at the time, if you asked them what the gospel was, would have given you basically what Rome articulates the gospel to be, you see. So in Bunyan's day, he's having to deal with the direct reality of the gospel being perverted by the Western church. He's dealing with that explicitly because that is Western Christianity. So he is going to be articulating in this section then how he understands the gospel over against what it is that Rome teaches in terms of what it means to stand right before God. So he's going to articulate that here. And you'll see it, I think you'll see it quite clearly as you read these paragraphs. You will see him diving directly into the teachings of Rome and pushing back against. Now, let me also suggest that he's probably pushing back against a great deal of the reinterpretation of the gospel that had done in some Protestant circles, particularly the Church of England, right? Because those would be the two great influences of England in his day. There is a fledgling Protestant movement, a Presbyterian movement, a fledgling Baptist movement at this time. But the real gospel is either coming out of Rome as the really big one or out of Anglicanism as the one next. You remember the reason why Bunyan's not in prison, why he's in prison? Is because he refused to conform to the teachings of the Anglican Church and their practices. That's why he's in prison. So his articulation of the gospel here is to push back against the wide sense of what the gospel was in that day, wrong as it was. Now, just for a quick review, the gospel that would have been understood by Rome is not in fact, now catch this, the gospel of Rome is not in fact a gospel of righteousness. It has nothing to do with righteousness. The nature of a man as righteous is irrelevant. All that matters from a Catholic perspective is that you have satisfied what the church claims is necessary for you to stand before God. But that's not righteousness. All right? That's a very different thing. It took me years to figure this out after I left the church, by the way, because I sort of automatically assumed, right, the church is supposed to be teaching what it means to be righteous, but it doesn't. It's really only interested in what it means to satisfy what the church says is required in order to stand before God. Not that God designed that, but the church designed that, okay? And so the articulation of the gospel in the 17th century would have simply been people who believed that by virtue of their adherence to the teachings of the church and the realities of doing what it is that you're supposed to do, and then leaving this world and going off into purgatory to finish the job, whatever the job might be, then you get to go into the presence of God. Now, it's interesting. Ask a Catholic exactly what is it that's taking place in purgatory to solve the issue. They don't know. They have no idea. They can't tell you what's going on. Well, there's some sort of temporal punishment. What does that mean? Is the person being transformed? Well, no, he's just satisfying what's needed in order for him to get into the presence of God. It isn't an issue of whether the person is being transformed. That's never been an issue. A Catholic is not concerned about his transformation. He's only concerned about his satisfaction of a certain set of responsibilities, you see. And we, of course, standing here in our day, as we teach here at Grace Fellowship, would say, well, that's not the gospel, is it? The gospel has to do with righteousness, a righteousness we don't naturally possess. Because the only thing we actually do naturally possess is an unrighteousness, or the exact opposite of righteousness. And so what we need is a righteousness. Well, the question is, where do we get that? Now, fast forward to our day, 2026, and ask yourself this question: what is the gospel as it's understood in our day? Well, let me suggest to you, it isn't much different than what was being perpetrated, isn't that interesting? Perpetrated by Rome in the 17th century. It's not much different. How do you get to stand before God? Is it a matter of righteousness? Or is it a matter of, well, as long as I've got X, Y, or Z, or do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to get there. What's interesting is here we are now in the 21st century. I don't know, any of you former Catholics have seen this in your own experience, but there's a number of dogmas of Roman Catholicism that would have been well embraced in the 17th century that have basically disappeared. For example, even purgatory itself is gone in much of the thinking of a Catholic. I think I've said this before. I have relatives who look at their dead relatives and say, well, they're in heaven. Well, wait a minute. I thought the dogma of the Catholic Church is they went to purgatory first. And he hadn't been dead long enough to have gotten out of purgatory, because I know how he lived. So what they've done is, in essence, deleted a great deal of even Catholic dogma in modern day. But if you go into evangelical territories, right? Ask the question, what does it mean? How does one stand before God? You will be hard-pressed to find someone who will say, through the righteousness of Christ. His righteousness imputed to me by faith in him. Most people would struggle to even understand what you're talking about if you said that to them. Did you know that you have to be fully righteous to go into the presence of God? And I don't mean fully righteous in the sense that you've satisfied a checklist, but fully and completely sinless and perfect morally in every sense, having fully kept the law perfectly. Do you understand that that's what it takes to get into the presence of God? Most of them would look at you like, what's he talking about? Because that's not really the message, is it? So much of the message now is that the gospel is either our benefit in this life. Here's what Jesus wants for you, right? And again, notice the irony of where we just came from. He wants you to have a nice, comfortable life. Or the gospel is, as the main lines have gone for the last 100 years, to solving the problems of this world, taking away oppression, taking away distinctions of class and race and poverty and all these other kinds of solving all these issues in the world. That becomes the gospel to many. So my point in all of that is to say this. If we don't have a pure understanding of the gospel, we're in real danger, aren't we? If we don't know what the actual gospel is, what it is that Christ would say to us if he were standing here, if the Apostle Paul were standing in front of us and saying to us, this is the gospel, if we don't know what that is, we're in big trouble. Because the gospel, as even Roman church would express, is that the gospel is the only way to God. Now, they wouldn't say it quite that way, but I think fundamentally they would believe that. Again, their gospel's different, but they would say that. It's the only way to God. So we need to know what this thing is. We need to be clear that we understand what it is that the Father ordained in eternity past. The Son came into the world to deliver verbally and physically, and what the Spirit communicates out of the Word to the hearts of the elect. What is that message? How does a man become a Christian? What does it mean to be a Christian? What is this gospel? And so I believe that Bunyan paints this because he really wants to answer that question. He wants to say, let me be clear about what this gospel is. And so he uses hopeful, speaking to Christian, as a way of articulating this. Now, question. Who brought hopeful to faith? Who? All right, let's rewind the story. Where are we introduced to hopeful? In Vanity Fair. After Faithful was martyred. After Faithful was killed for his beliefs. Now Hopeful joins Christian on the walk. So Bunyan takes Faithful out of the picture. He doesn't want to martyr Christian because the story comes to an end, right? Remember? So he adds Hopeful to the path. So now they're walking along. So who brings Hopeful to faith? Faithful does. Faithful does. Okay, so you'll see that as we read this. It is Faithful, the man, who brings this. So another way to put it would be like this. Christian comes to faith because of whom? Say that louder. Evangelist. I can read your lips. Evangelist. Hopeful comes to faith through Faithful. Okay? But in both cases, it's men who preach this gospel and bring salvation into the lives of a person. All right, so that's a fundamental starting point. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing from someone who's preaching, to summarize Paul. Okay? All right, so into this next section then, it says this, said Hopeful. Well, I could not tell what to do. Okay, so to do about what? Well, remember what he said a moment ago. How came I at first to look after the good of my soul? So what's the concern? The good of my soul. Hopeful says, I didn't know what to do about that. I didn't know what to do about the good of my soul. Now, I would suggest to you that Bunyan starts right off the bat with the right place to start. I have argued consistently and regularly through many years of teaching that if you don't get your view of man correct, the rest of your theology is going to go down the drain. You have to start with a proper view of mankind. Most Christians don't start there properly. They start with something else. You have to start with a proper view of man. Hopeful says, when it came to the good of my soul, I didn't know what to do. See that? That's a statement of saying, I was as lost as you can get. I didn't know what to do. So I broke my mind to Faithful. I told Faithful of my dilemma. I told Faithful this. I told Faithful that I didn't know what to do about my own soul. The gospel starts with this reality. Men are fallen and they're dead in their trespasses and sins. They cannot save themselves. They can't. The best way to say that is men are such that they cannot do what is required to be righteous in the sight of God. They can do many good things. They can even do many righteous things. But they ultimately cannot do that which God himself requires. Now, of course, we know what God requires, right? He requires perfection. He requires holiness. No imperfection, no unholiness can come into the presence of a holy God. Okay, so our fundamental problem is here is God who is holy and here is man who is not. So we start with that supposition. And Hopeful says, I told that to Faithful. I told that to Faithful. For he and I were well acquainted. See? Apparently they knew each other in the story. Again, we're not exactly told where, but somewhere in Vanity Fair. It would appear that Hopeful was in Vanity Fair. So at some particular point, he was acquainted with Faithful. They were well acquainted. And so he told this man of that. Now listen to what he says next. What he says next is hard to interpret, but it's really not. I thought, all right, here's the thought I had in my head. This is hopeful speaking about his condition. I thought, if a man runs into debt, but later pays his way, the old debt still stands. Now, what does that mean? Okay. All right, so I decide to go to college, big university, let's call it Harvard. And I decide to go there, and I run up this big bill while I'm there, because that's inevitable, right? So now I have this massive debt. And I come out of Harvard and I get a job, I get a good job, and I start working. And as a result of that job, I start paying my bills, right? I rent an apartment, I buy a car, I pay the utility bills, I buy groceries, all that sort of thing. And I'm paying my way as I'm going along. I have the money and the resources, I'm going along and I'm paying my way. And the result is that I'm making my way in the world. What's the problem? The debt with Harvard is still there. It hangs over me. Now, it may be true that I may be making payments on the debt that I'm supposed to pay to Harvard, but even then, how long does it take to go away? Well, based on my example, and given the fact that it's Harvard, and given the fact that my degree was in underwater basket weaving, it is highly unlikely that I have a job that's going to pay enough to make my way and pay off that debt. So this is what Hopeful says. He says, this was my condition. I have a debt to pay to God, a debt of holiness and righteousness and perfection. Now, I was going along being a good person. I was going along going to church on a regular basis. I was going along doing my thing, paying my way religiously, if you will. But the problem is, the debt's still there. I'm not actually able to pay down that debt. It hangs over me like that debt that I cannot get rid of. And in the case, of course, of this, they don't give you a coupon book that you can go and start paying it down. Now, our Catholic friends would say they do, but they would be wrong. The fact is what Hopeful says is, here was my real condition. I'm sitting here with a load of debt, which is my fundamental problem. I am a sinner. And that sin has made me such that I am broken from my Creator. I am no longer able to walk into the garden and walk and talk with the Lord. I have been banished from the garden by virtue of being a sinner. That's my problem. And I can't fix it, no matter how well I pay my way along the way. See, that is a proper understanding of the human condition. Again, where do you got to start? You've got to get the human condition right in order to understand what this gospel is. He says, I by my sins have run into God's debt, and my reforming now will not pay it off. This is exactly what Luther encountered in the midst of his situation as a nearly suicidal monk / priest. I have this load of debt, I can't seem to pay it off. No matter what I do, no matter how good I become, no matter how reformed I become in my life, no matter how pure and moral and upright I live my life, my problem is I still got debt. I still bear this debt. I can't get rid of. I can't end it. I can't unload it. And I can't chip away at it, even. So Hopeful tells Faithful this a bit of reality. Here's who I truly am. When Bunyan's point, and I think if he were here, he would say, yeah, okay, so when we're going to preach this gospel, this is where you got to start. You got to point out where the individual is. What are you before the living God? Not what do you do? What are you? I should have worn my t-shirt tonight, right? It's not what you do, it's who you are. Our problem isn't what we do, the problem is what we are. We are debt bearers before a holy God. We cannot change that. Our nature is such that we are incapable of doing the kinds of things that would actually satisfy a holy God. The gospel requires that bad news to begin. You got to start there. Otherwise, it's not really the good news. It's not really the gospel. It's not really the evangel if you don't tell the truth about what the human condition really is. Now, we're reluctant to do that, aren't we? We're reluctant to do that because there's a little part of us that still thinks, no, I'm pretty good. But there's also a sense within us when we look at other people, they believe that fully. And if you tell them the truth, well, you're going to wreck their life. Because now they're going to hopefully understand what they really are. But nonetheless, the gospel has to start there. It has to go there. Or as Paul says at the beginning of Ephesians 2, you're dead in your trespasses and sins. I don't care how many life rafts they send to you and how many life rings they throw you, you are dead. Our synergist friends would say, well, no, it's the illustration would better be that we're in a pool and we're swimming and we're kind of drowning, but we're still able to keep our heads above water a little bit, and then when someone throws us a life ring, we grab onto it. The problem with that imagery is this. Nope. You are already dead at the bottom of the pool. You're already dead at the bottom of the pool. And in fact, I would even go so far as you're dead at the bottom of the pool and all the little bugs in the pool have eaten you to the point where there's nothing left of you there. There's no hope for you to come back to life, quote unquote, and grab the life ring. No, you're dead. You're dead. I'm convinced that that's why Jesus waited till the fourth day to go and raise his friend. I want to make sure everybody knows he's dead. There won't be any mistaking when I call him forth. Oh, and just an aside, I really think that he starts with his name. Lazarus, come out. And you know why? Because if he didn't use his name, everybody that was dead would come out. Just saying. Dead men do not respond to the gospel. Dead men do not do righteous things. Dead men do not pay their debts. Dead men are dead men. So what does Faithful tell him? Well, let's play modern gospel for a moment. Faithful tells him, well, you just got to try harder. Or, Hopeful, you just got to believe harder. You just have to, God loves you just the way you are. I mean, every time I hear that, it makes me cringe because it's like, oh, God loves you in your dead condition. Really? Is that the message you want to send? No. So what does Faithful tell him in response to that? Hopeful says, he told me that unless I could obtain the righteousness of a man that had never sinned, neither mine own nor all the righteousness of the world could save me. All right, so let me heap some more bad news on you. You think you got it bad now. Let me tell you this. Even if you had the ability to do every imaginable righteous thing, you ain't making one bit of progress from this point. So Faithful comes to him and says, yeah, I get it. You are in trouble, aren't you? You are deeply in trouble. But even in the midst of that, though, you'll notice he holds out a hope in the midst of it. So he says, if you could obtain the righteousness of a man that had never sinned, all right? So he is giving to Hopeful at the beginning of this, intertwined with the bad news that Hopeful cannot solve his soul problem. He's giving him nonetheless the bit of hope that is needed. Because what he says, in essence, and we'll flesh out more as we go, what he says is, your righteousness will never do it. But there's someone who will. There is someone who is able to give you the righteousness that you need. Okay, that becomes the turn in the gospel. The beginning of the gospel is you're dead in your trespasses and sins. You're going to hell, whether you like it or not. You can resist, you can be religious, you can be moral. Read Romans 1-3. Paul condemns all of them. You think you could be a moralist, you think you could be a religionist, you think you could be a good Jew, you think you could be someone who is, read every book, climbed every mountain, done every spiritual thing imaginable, obeys the church with perfect obedience, you're still dead and you're not making one bit of progress. But here's the good news. There is a righteousness that can be obtained, but it's not yours. And that is where the gospel then comes forth. Now, I would argue that what we've already talked about is the gospel. The first bit of the gospel is we're dead. But now we turn to say what you need is something you have never thought of. What would not naturally come to your mind as a man dead in his sins. For in your fallen state, you would not be naturally inclined to seek the righteousness of someone else. You would be inclined to seek it from yourself. Our pride as human beings, again, what's the most fundamental sin of the human race? Self-centered pride. The self-centered pride that we have means that in our fallen state, we are not inclined ever to seek a righteousness from someone else, only from ourselves. So Faithful gives to Hopeful here in the testimony, as Hopeful's relating it. Faithful told me this. Yeah, you're right. You got no righteousness. But there is one that can come. So we'll break there, and we'll talk about how this comes as Faithful gives more to this story. But I think if go ahead and read on from where I ended here and listen to what it is that how Bunyan paints this gospel message that Hopeful gives as a testimony. Read it, and you may be shocked by the depth of it, the richness of it, as compared to so much of the gospel that appears in our day.